The September sun lingered longer than expected that year, casting golden light across the hedgerows and the rolling fields of Hampshire. Ashford Manor, with its ivy-draped walls and tall windows, stood proudly at the edge of the village, looking both inviting and secretive. For decades, the manor had belonged to the Whitmore family. Colonel James Whitmore, a retired officer with a stern jaw and a surprising fondness for gardening, had inherited the estate from his uncle. Though he had little love for social gatherings, the colonel's wife, Margaret, adored company. She insisted on hosting 1 or 2 dinners every year, reminding her husband that a house without guests is nothing more than a museum. And so, on the evening of September 17th, the Whitmores welcomed a curious mix of visitors. Each had their own story, and each had their own reasons, though not all of them were innocent for accepting the invitation. The guests arrive. By 6 o'clock, the carriages and motor cars began to arrive. First came Reverend Charles Benson, a stout man in his early 60s with rosy cheeks and a booming laugh. He was beloved in the parish for his warmth, though some whispered he was a little too fond of sherry. Not long after came Dr. Evelyn Clark, the village physician. Tall, sharp-eyed, and brisk in her manner, she had gained a reputation for knowing everyone's secrets, whether medical or otherwise. Mr. Harold Penrose, a businessman of uncertain dealings, followed shortly. With his perfectly waxed mustache and watch chain glinting in the evening light, he looked the part of success. Yet there were rumors that his ventures had not always been honest. Lady Constance Ashworth arrived last, sweeping into the manor with an air of authority. A widow of considerable wealth, she was accustomed to commanding attention. Her diamond brooch caught the lamplight as she adjusted her gloves and greeted Margaret Whitmore with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. At the dining table, with candles flickering and silverware polished to a shine, the group made polite conversation. The soup was hot, the wine plentiful, and the laughter steady. Yet beneath the surface, there were tensions, quiet glances exchanged, and words left unsaid. A whisper of trouble. Colonel Whitmore raised his glass for a toast. To friends, old and new, he declared. May Ashford Manor always be a place of warmth and welcome. The words were well received, but in the pause that followed, a curious silence settled. It was Lady Constance who broke it, leaning ever so slightly toward Harold Penrose. I trust, she said in a low but cutting voice, that your business affairs are in better order than the last time we spoke. The remark drew a flush to Penrose's cheeks. Dr. Clark's eyes darted across the table, quietly noting the exchange. The Reverend coughed awkwardly into his napkin. Margaret Whitmore quickly changed the subject, but the tension lingered, invisible yet heavy in the air. By the time dessert was served, a storm was brewing outside, wind rattling the windows and rain spattering against the glass. Inside, conversation grew more animated, fueled by wine and a curious undercurrent of hostility. The incident. It was just after 10 when it happened. The guests had moved to the drawing room, where the fire crackled and a game of cards had begun. Lady Constance sat regally in an armchair, watching the play with thinly veiled disdain. Dr. Clark excused herself to fetch a book she had left in the library. Then came the sound. A heavy thud followed by the unmistakable crash of glass shattering. Margaret was the first to rise. James, she called, alarmed. What was that? The guests hurried into the corridor, following the sound. At the foot of the grand staircase lay Colonel Whitmore, motionless. His glass had slipped from his hand and shattered beside him. His eyes stared wide open, unseeing. Lady Constance gasped. The Reverend crossed himself. Dr. Clark, arriving breathless from the library, pushed past the others and knelt beside the Colonel. "It's no use," she said quietly after a moment. "He's gone. Dash dash." A shocking twist. At first, there was talk of a heart attack. The Colonel was not a young man, and sudden death was not uncommon. But then Dr. Clark's sharp eyes narrowed as she examined the fallen glass and the faint traces on his lips. "This," she said firmly, "was no accident. Colonel Whitmore has been poisoned." The words hung in the air like thunder. Every guest froze, their faces pale in the firelight. Poison. Someone in the house had killed him. The rain battered harder against the windows, as though the storm outside had been summoned to echo the tension within. Colonel Whitmore's body lay at the foot of the staircase, still and solemn, while the guests clustered around in disbelief. Margaret Whitmore, her face drained of color, clutched the banister for support. "Poison," she whispered. "But, who would do such a thing?" Dr. Clark removed her spectacles, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief. Her voice was calm, but her words carried a razor's edge. The faint bluish tinge on his lips, the glass at his side, it's unmistakable. "Cyanide, I should think." Lady Constance let out a sharp cry. "How dreadful! To think that we sat dining together not an hour ago." The Reverend Benson, who had grown uncharacteristically quiet, cleared his throat. "Then if what Dr. Clark says is true, the poison must have been administered during dinner. Which means..." He trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. But Harold Penrose did not hesitate. "Which means," he said darkly, "that one of us sitting at this table is a murderer. Dash dash." Locking the doors. Margaret's eyes darted from one face to another, horror etched across her features. No. Surely not, surely there must be another explanation. But Dr. Clark shook her head. The Colonel's death was deliberate. There can be no question. Penrose turned to the butler, an elderly man named Hargreaves who had served the family for decades. "Bolt the doors. No one leaves this house until the authorities arrive." Hargreaves hesitated, glancing at Margaret for approval. She gave a weak nod. With a heavy sigh, he moved to lock the front door, the sound of the key turning in the lock echoing through the silent hall. They were trapped together, a group of 6: Margaret, Dr. Clark, Lady Constance, Reverend Benson, Penrose, and the butler. One of them was a killer. Dash dash. The inspector arrives. It was nearly midnight when Inspector Alfred Grant arrived, summoned by a frantic call from Hargreaves. A stocky man with a bulldog face and a reputation for persistence, Grant wasted no time in assuming control. "Right," he said briskly, surveying the room where the body lay. "No one in or out, Hargreaves tells me. Good. Now then, Dr. Clark, you say poison?" "Yes. All signs point to cyanide." Grant's eyes narrowed. "And you'd know how to identify such a thing?" Dr. Clark bristled. "I am the village physician." "I should hope so." "Very well." Grant scribbled in his notebook. "We'll need the body examined in detail, but for now, let us have the facts." The Colonel collapsed around 10 o'clock, yes, who was with him? The guests recounted the events: the dinner, the move to the drawing room, the sudden crash. Grant tapped his pencil. If the poison was taken at dinner, it could be even in his food or drink. Did anyone notice anything unusual? Lady Constance raised her chin. "I did notice the Colonel's wine glass was refilled more often than the rest." By Hargreaves. The butler stiffened. Madam, I poured as I always do. Penrose sneered. A convenient excuse, isn't it the perfect opportunity? Enough, snapped the inspector. We'll not leap to conclusions. Everyone here will be questioned, and I'll have the truth out if it takes till dawn. Hidden tensions. The questioning began in the library, one by one. Margaret Whitmore was first. She sat pale and trembling, her handkerchief damp from tears. My husband had no enemies, she insisted. None at all. He was a good man, devoted to his garden, his books. I cannot imagine anyone wishing him harm. Yet when pressed, she admitted the colonel had been strict in his dealings, both with tenants and family. James was firm, she said at last. He expected obedience. Some may have resented that. Next came Reverend Benson, whose jovial manner had all but vanished. I was fond of the colonel, he said nervously. We disagreed at times. He thought I meddled too much in village affairs, but there was no malice. I swear it. Inspector Grant leaned forward. And yet, Reverend, you were heard arguing with him last month in the churchyard. The Reverend flushed scarlet. A trivial matter. The colonel refused a donation for repairs, that is all. Surely you don't think. Grant merely grunted, making a note. Harold Penrose followed. Smooth and composed, he lounged in the chair as though the whole affair were a business meeting. Colonel Whitmore and I were acquaintances, nothing more, he said lightly. I invest in various ventures, and he once considered joining me. He declined his loss, I dare say. Grant's eyes were sharp. Some say your ventures have been questionable. That you've cost men their fortunes. Penrose's smile tightened. Idle gossip. Besides, if I were to poison everyone who refused me, Hampshire would be littered with corpses. When Lady Constance entered, she swept into the room as though it were her drawing room. The colonel was insufferably pompous, she declared. But hardly worth killing. If you want my opinion, Inspector, you should look to that man Penrose. He's as slippery as an eel. Grant raised a brow. And you, Lady Constance, you stood to inherit a tidy sum from the colonel's estate, did you not? For the first time, her composure faltered. That was a private arrangement. Alone he promised to forgive. But murder preposterous. Finally came Dr. Evelyn Clark. Her tone was cool, almost detached. I respected the colonel, she said. But he had enemies, whether his wife wishes to admit it or not. He was stubborn, domineering, and not above threatening those who crossed him. I could list a half-dozen villagers with grudges. Yet it is you, said Grant, who identified the poison so swiftly. Her eyes flashed. Because I am competent, Inspector. Do you suspect every doctor who recognizes a broken bone of pushing their patient down the stairs? Grant said nothing, but he wrote carefully in his notebook. Secrets in the shadows. By 2 in the morning, the guests were confined to their rooms, the manor silent save for the storm outside. Inspector Grant remained in the library, his pipe glowing faintly in the lamplight as he reviewed his notes. Margaret Whitmore, grieving, but hiding something. Reverend Benson, quarrel with the colonel, financial disputes. Harold Penrose, shady dealings, motive in money. Lady Constance, debt forgiven upon the colonel's death. Dr. Clark, knowledge of poison, cool under pressure. Hargreaves the butler, opportunity with the wine. Each had reason. Each had opportunity. And yet, something about the scene gnawed at him. The glass, the precise timing, the casual way the poison had slipped into the Colonel's drink. This was no crime of passion. It was planned, calculated. Grant leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. One of them, he muttered, is lying. And tomorrow, I'll find out which. Outside, the storm began to break. But inside Ashford Manor, the darkness had only just begun. The storm cleared by morning, leaving Ashford Manor wrapped in a damp mist. Inspector Grant, who had taken little sleep, gathered the household in the drawing room once again. The air was heavy, the fire burned low, and the sense of suspicion clung to every corner. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grant began, "last night I questioned each of you. What I heard gave me motives aplenty but not the truth. This morning, we'll set matters straight." Margaret sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes red from weeping. Lady Constance perched on the edge of her chair like a hawk waiting to strike. Reverend Benson fidgeted with his collar. Penrose stared coolly into the fire. Dr. Clark remained composed, her gaze level. Grant paced slowly before them. The Colonel's glass held traces of cyanide. Whoever placed it there did so at dinner or very shortly after. "Now, I've had a word with Hargreaves. Tell them what you told me." The butler, dignified despite the dark circles beneath his eyes, inclined his head. "I poured wine for all, sir. But I recall that the Colonel's glass was exchanged midway through the meal." Lady Constance remarked upon a smudge, "and I fetched him a fresh one." All eyes turned to Lady Constance. Her face tightened. "Indeed, I did. The glass looked unclean, and I will not drink from dirty crystal." "Surely you don't suggest—" "I suggest nothing yet," said Grant. But the moment that glass was replaced, the opportunity arose. An unsettling discovery. Grant dispatched Hargreaves to search the kitchens and returned shortly after with a small brown bottle. He handed it to the inspector with a grim expression. "Found hidden behind the flour sacks, sir." Grant held the bottle up. A faint chemical odor escaped as he loosened the stopper. "Cyanide," he confirmed. Gasps filled the room. "But how could such a thing be in this house?" Margaret cried. Dr. Clark's eyes narrowed. "Cyanide is used in small quantities by gardeners, to deal with pests. Did the Colonel not maintain an extensive greenhouse?" Grant nodded slowly. "True enough. Which means the poison was close at hand to anyone with knowledge of the estate." He let the bottle rest on the mantelpiece, deliberately visible, as though daring the guilty party to look away. The Reverend's secret. The first to crack was Reverend Benson. His round face glistened with sweat as he rose suddenly to his feet. "Inspector, I cannot bear this. I must tell the truth." The room leaned forward. "I was in debt," he confessed, wringing his hands. "The church roof repairs, the parish fund was short. I borrowed from the Colonel, believing I could repay him in time. But he threatened to expose me, to shame me before the whole congregation if I failed. Yes, I quarreled with him bitterly. But I swear I would never resort to murder." Grant studied him carefully. "A strong motive, Reverend. And you were at the Colonel's elbow when the wine was poured." "I may be a fool," Benson cried, "but I am no killer." He collapsed back into his chair, trembling. Margaret's grief. Grant turned his attention to Margaret. "Madam, I must ask, did you know of your husband's will?" Her eyes flickered. His will. Indeed. The Colonel revised it last month. Most curious timing. Substantial sums were to pass not only to you, but to Lady Constance here. Lady Constance lifted her chin, defiant. A debt repaid, nothing more. Margaret shook her head, anguish spilling over. I had no knowledge. James kept his affairs close. But if you mean to suggest I poisoned my own husband. Her voice broke. I loved him. He was stern, yes, but he was my life. Grant said nothing, though his eyes lingered on her pale face. Dash dash. Penrose under fire. The inspector's gaze shifted to Harold Penrose. Mr. Penrose, it seems you and the Colonel shared more than polite acquaintance. He invested with you once, did he not? Penrose's mustache twitched. A minor venture, years ago. It failed, yes, but at no great loss to him. Yet I've discovered, Grant continued, that the Colonel threatened legal action against you only last month. Fraudulent dealings, he called them. For the first time, Penrose's composure cracked. His voice hardened. He had no proof. And besides, men of business must take risks. If every investment gone sour ended in murder, there'd be none of us left alive. Still, his hand trembled as he reached for his cigarette case. Dash dash. Dr. Clark's coolness. Finally, Grant faced Dr. Clark. You, more than any here, understand poisons. You recognized the signs instantly. Perhaps too quickly. Her lips curved in a faint smile. Would you prefer I had kept silent, let you bumble in the dark until morning? Not silent, Grant said slowly. But a little too certain, perhaps. As though you knew precisely what had been used. Dr. Clark met his stare unflinchingly. Inspector, any competent physician could have drawn the same conclusion. If you mean to accuse me, do so plainly. But Grant only puffed at his pipe, saying nothing. Dash dash. A clue in the study. That afternoon, Grant conducted a careful search of the Colonel's study. Papers were scattered across the desk, but one letter caught his eye. It was half burned in the fireplace, only partially legible. If you pursue this matter, I will ruin you. I have the documents, and I shall not hesitate. The signature was gone, but the implication was clear. Someone had been desperate to silence the Colonel. Grant folded the charred scrap carefully. He was building a picture, one of debts, threats, and secrets festering beneath polite smiles. Dash dash. A second shock. Just as the inspector prepared to gather everyone again, a piercing scream echoed through the hall. He raced toward the sound, followed by the others, and found Lady Constance standing rigid in the doorway of her guest room. On the floor lay a crumpled sheet of paper. She pointed with a trembling hand. It was slipped under my door. Grant picked it up. The message was short, scrawled in a hurried hand. You will be next if you speak too freely. Gasps rippled through the group. Someone here, Lady Constance hissed, is not only a murderer but a coward who dares threaten me. Grant's eyes scanned their pale faces. Fear was beginning to crack their masks. And fear, he knew, often drove the guilty to mistakes. Dash dash. Closing the net. By evening, the household was fraying at the edges. The Reverend prayed loudly in the corner, Margaret wept quietly in her room, Penrose drank steadily, and Lady Constance demanded protection at every turn. Grant, however, was calm. He had set a small trap. Hargreaves was instructed to leave the cyanide bottle unattended in the library, its stopper slightly loose, as though forgotten. And sure enough, just past midnight, footsteps crept down the corridor. A hand reached for the bottle, hesitated, then lifted it from the mantelpiece. "Put it back," Grant's voice cut through the darkness. The lamplight flared, revealing the figure frozen in place, bottle in hand. It was Inspector Grant's pipe smoke curled in the lamplight as he stepped forward. His voice was calm, but the weight of authority filled the room. "Set the bottle down." Slowly. The figure obeyed, trembling fingers placing the cyanide vial back on the mantelpiece. As the light fell across their face, the gasps came all at once. It was Margaret Whitmore. Her pale features were taut, her eyes wide as though she had been caught stealing from her own pantry rather than meddling with death. "Margaret," Lady Constance whispered, horrified. "You." "No," Margaret cried, her voice breaking. "It isn't what it seems. I only wished to throw it away to rid the house of it once and for all. I could not bear its presence here, mocking me." Grant's gaze was steady. "You would have us believe you wandered the halls at midnight, bottle in hand, merely to spare your nerves." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes. I swear it." But the inspector's eyes said otherwise. The inspector's reconstruction. "Let us consider," Grant began, turning to address them all, "how this crime was committed. The Colonel's death was no accident. The poison was in his glass placed there after Lady Constance insisted upon a clean one." Lady Constance bristled. "Are you accusing me?" "No, madam. You unwittingly provided the opportunity. The butler fetched a new glass, but the one who saw to it that poison touched the Colonel's lips was clever enough to wait until the right moment." He paced slowly, eyes fixed on Margaret. "You see, cyanide leaves a bitter almond scent. The Colonel would have noticed had it been added in his wine while he drank. But in a fresh glass, poured after a complaint, he would have drunk deeply, unsuspecting." Margaret shook her head violently. "No, no, you're wrong." But Grant pressed on. "Last night, I found a half-burned letter in the Colonel's study. A threat, warning someone that the Colonel would expose them. At first I thought it referred to Penrose, or to the Reverend, but there was one person above all whom the Colonel controlled, whose life was dictated by his stern hand." He turned fully toward Margaret. "His wife. Margaret's motive." The room went still. Grant's voice softened, but it carried no mercy. "For years, you lived beneath his iron will. Every decision, every penny, every breath dictated by the Colonel's temper. And when at last he threatened to change his will, to leave you with nothing but a pittance while forgiving Lady Constance's debts, you saw your future crumble." Margaret's lips trembled. She pressed her hands to her face. "You believed you had no choice," Grant continued. "You slipped the poison into his wine, perhaps trembling as you did so, but certain you would at last be free." "Stop," Margaret whispered. "You played the grieving widow, and well. But the guilt gnawed at you. Tonight, you tried to remove the evidence, the bottle that could condemn you. You thought no one would see. Enough." Margaret's cry rang through the hall. She rose to her feet, her eyes wild, and for a moment the mask fell away. "Yes," she hissed, "I did it. I killed him. Do you know what it was to live with him, to be scolded for every word, corrected for every breath he caged me in this house, treated me as a servant, a decoration, never as a woman with thoughts of her own? I could not endure it another year, another day." Her voice cracked, fierce and broken at once. When he told me he meant to leave it all to Constance, to strip me of my home, my security. I knew then. Better he die than I live on in misery. Dash dash. Shock and silence. The confession settled like ash after fire. Lady Constance stared, speechless for once. The Reverend muttered a prayer under his breath. Penrose's face was unreadable, though a flicker of something admiration, perhaps passed his eyes. Grant nodded slowly, his expression grim but unsurprised. Margaret Whitmore, you are under arrest for the murder of your husband, Colonel James Whitmore. She gave no resistance as Hargreaves stepped forward, tears streaming silently down his lined cheeks as he obeyed the inspector's command. Dash dash. The aftermath. Morning broke over Ashford Manor, the mist lifting to reveal a house forever changed. The guests prepared to depart, their faces etched with fatigue and unease. Lady Constance, adjusting her hat before the mirror, muttered, "Imagine, all this time, it was she. The dutiful wife. One never knows." The Reverend shook his head sorrowfully. A tragedy. A tragedy of the soul as much as the body. Penrose merely shrugged. People will kill for money. Or freedom. Or both. It is the oldest story there is. Dr. Clark, who had said little since the confession, approached Grant as he prepared his notes. "You handled her gently," she remarked. "She was no hardened criminal," Grant replied. "Just a woman pushed beyond her limits. That does not excuse murder, but it explains it." Dr. Clark studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Perhaps that is justice enough." Dash dash. A final reflection. As the last carriage rattled away and silence returned to the manor, Inspector Grant stood alone on the gravel drive. The ivy on the walls shivered in the wind, the house looming above him with its secrets laid bare. He struck a match, lit his pipe, and exhaled slowly. In the end, he murmured to himself, mysteries are never about the method, but the heart. And hearts are dangerous things. He turned toward the village, coat flapping in the morning breeze, leaving Ashford Manor to its ghosts.